It happened in just 120 seconds. J.D. Vance, humiliated live under the blinding lights of a national broadcast, stood there, the weight of millions of eyes pressing down. Bernie Sanders, a titan of politics, had just unleashed a public insult so cutting it drew gasps from the crowd. But what no one expected was what came next. In those 2 minutes, JD's voice, steady and unshaken, revealed a truth so powerful, so undeniable, that it shattered Bernie's legendary status right before the nation's eyes. The crowd that once cheered turned silent. The air in that studio, electric, heavy, unforgettable. And as you hear this story, ask yourself, could you have stood your ground that night? Could you have found the strength to speak when it mattered most? What you're about to hear is a dramatized story, drawn from familiar names, yet shaped with imagination to explore courage, dignity, and the power of words. The scene may be fiction, but the questions it asks and the emotions it stirs are very real. Let these next moments draw you in, because some stories remind us who we truly are. The nation held its breath. Beyond the bright lights, beyond the polished floors and the steady hum of cameras, there was something larger filling the space, a tension so thick it felt as though the very air vibrated with it. Tonight wasn't just another debate. Tonight was a reckoning, and as millions tuned in, across living rooms, factory break rooms, coffee shops, and quiet porches, one question echoed unspoken in hearts everywhere. Who would truly fight for us? J.D. Vance stepped forward, his figure cutting through the charged atmosphere like a quiet force of nature. On his lapel, a small steelworker's pin glinted, not for show, not for sympathy, but as a silent promise, a reminder of where he came from. Beneath the calm he wore like armor, his heart pounded, not with fear, but with the weight of those he carried with him. The mill workers who'd nodded at him in town halls, the families who'd handed him letters, their words shaking as they begged for someone to listen. His face revealed none of this. It was the mask of a man who knew that tonight, the wrong word could betray them all. And yet, in his stillness, in the way his eyes scanned the room and met Bernie's, there was something almost defiant, as if to say, I do not fear this fight because it is not for me, it is for them. Then came Bernie Sanders. The room's energy shifted, not louder, not softer, but different. He walked with the weight of years, each step steady, but marked by the long road that had brought him here. His face was a map of battles fought, lines etched by time, by sleepless nights spent writing legislation no one would read, by marches in the rain, by speeches shouted over jeers and cheers alike. His eyes, though, his eyes still burned with the fire that had lit up rallies and college halls, that had drawn the young, the weary, the desperate to his side. But if one looked closely, truly looked, behind that fire there flickered a weariness, the quiet toll of carrying too many hopes on shoulders that, despite their strength, had aged under the burden. The two men stood apart, yet closer than any physical distance could define. Their eyes met, a glance that spoke more than any words could. There was no handshake, no forced smile, no pretense of camaraderie, only recognition, a silent acknowledgement between two men who understood that what lay ahead wasn't simply an exchange of ideas. It was a battle for something far greater, for the narrative that would shape a divided, uncertain nation, for the right to say this is the path forward. And as that unspoken moment hung in the air, those watching felt it too, the sense that something rare was about to unfold, a clash not of personalities, but of visions. A night when the words chosen and the truths revealed, or hidden, could ripple far beyond that stage into the lives of those who watched, hoped, and feared. What promises would be made? What lines would be crossed? What truths, once spoken, could never be taken back? This was no ordinary debate, and no one, not in that room, not across the country, wanted to miss what came next. The silence that hung between J.D. Vance and Bernie Sanders seemed to stretch longer than the cameras captured. It wasn't the pause of hesitation, but the breath before history begins to write itself. Then, breaking that tension, came the voice of the moderator. Steady, practiced, but tonight tinged with the weight of knowing that the question he was about to ask would set the course for what followed. "Gentlemen," he began, his eyes moving from one podium to the other, "millions of Americans tonight are wondering, how did we get here? Towns hollowed out, factories closed, families struggling to put food on the table, and trust in leadership broken. What do you say to a nation that feels forgotten, angry, and afraid?" The question didn't just hover in the air. It carved through it, like a blade slicing open the divisions so many tried to ignore. Across the country, those watching felt seen in a way that was both comforting and painful, because to hear the truth spoken aloud was to admit just how deep the wounds ran. JD was the first to answer. He didn't rush. There was no flourish, no grand gesture, just his voice, low and steady, carrying the quiet conviction of someone who had lived what he spoke. He spoke of the mills that once roared with life and now stood silent, of fathers who worked double shifts so their kids could have a future, of mothers who waited at night, hoping the plant wouldn't close before dawn. He spoke of promises made and broken, of trade deals that felt like betrayals, of the dignity stolen from men and women who asked for nothing more than a chance to work hard and provide. And as he spoke, the studio seemed smaller somehow, as if the walls had closed in to listen, as if for a moment the cameras, the lights, the stage itself had faded, leaving only JD's words and the truths they carried. Then came Bernie's turn. His voice in contrast rang louder, fuller, the voice of rallies, of protests, of decades spent calling out what he saw as injustice. He painted in bold strokes universal health care, tuition-free college, breaking the grip of corporate greed. He spoke of the billionaires who, in his words, had rigged the system, who had turned democracy into a playground for the wealthy while ordinary Americans paid the price. His passion filled the space, his words rising like a wave, powerful and unrelenting, washing over the audience in the studio and across the nation. He promised change, sweeping, immediate, transformative. And as he spoke, some at home felt hope rekindled, while others felt unease at the magnitude of what he proposed. Through it all, JD listened, his gaze steady, his thoughts a quiet storm beneath that composed exterior. He felt the weight of every mill town, every shuttered plant, every family that had whispered, "Speak for us." He knew he wasn't just answering a question, he was carrying a promise. Bernie, too, felt his own burden. The fire that had driven him all these years, the cause that had given him purpose, the belief that this night could still change the course of a country teetering at the edge. And as the first exchange drew to a close, the air between them crackled with more than disagreement. It held the unspoken understanding that what came next would not just be debate, it would be a battle for the story America would tell itself when the night was over. The hum of the cameras returned, almost imperceptible, as if the room itself waited, breath held, for the next words that would shape history. The tension that followed their first exchange didn't break. It simply shifted, settled into the rhythm of the debate. The next questions came, and with them a series of measured, almost polite responses. JD spoke in crisp, direct terms about tax policy, infrastructure, and revitalizing American manufacturing. Bernie answered with familiar passion, calling for wealth redistribution, stronger unions, and protections for the vulnerable. The sharp edges of disagreement were there, but smoothed over for now by the formality of the stage. Each man gave the other space, their voices steady, their words carefully chosen, like seasoned chess players testing each other's defenses before the real game began. Outside the studio, the country was anything but calm. On social media, the battle lines were already drawn. Hashtags trended within minutes. Hashtag JD for workers, hashtag Bernie for justice, hashtag debate night. Comment sections on news sites and video streams filled with arguments, praise, anger, and hope. Some saw JD as the voice of forgotten towns, the steady hand who could bring back jobs and dignity. Others hailed Bernie as the conscience of the nation, the only one brave enough to take on the powerful and speak hard truths. And still others watched in silence, unsure, searching for the leader who might finally speak to their own pain. But inside that arena of words, JD barely heard the noise from beyond those walls. As the next question was asked, something about energy policy, his mind slipped just for a breath to Middletown, to the mill where his grandfather had worked, where the air smelled of hot steel and sweat, where calloused hands built the bones of a nation. He remembered the quiet pride in his grandfather's eyes, a pride that no paycheck could measure. And he thought of his mother standing at the kitchen sink in the gray light of early morning, counting bills, worry etched into her face, but trying to hide it for his sake. These were not abstractions to JD. They were his reasons, the fire beneath his calm, the weight behind every word he spoke tonight. And across the stage, Bernie too felt the gravity of this moment in his bones. To the world he seemed as fiery as ever. The familiar cadence, the sharp gestures, the voice that could fill a stadium without a microphone. But inside, beneath that outer force, ran a different current. He knew this might be his last great battle, the last time he would stand on a stage like this, before the cameras, before the people. Retirement loomed on the horizon, not because he wished it, but because time has its way with even the most stubborn of fighters. And so, every word, every promise, every vision he laid out tonight carried a deeper urgency. This was his final chance to etch his dream for America into the hearts of those watching. The debate moved on, topic to topic, the exchanges polite but purposeful. But beneath the surface of civility, something gathered. A storm neither man could yet see, but both felt in the tension that clung to the edges of every sentence. And as the hum of the cameras softened into the background, the nation, divided, hopeful, angry, waiting, leaned in closer, sensing that the real battle had yet to begin. The debate's rhythm, so carefully measured, so deliberately respectful in its early moments, began to shift. It was subtle at first, the tightening of Bernie Sanders' jaw as he listened to JD's steady, deliberate answers, the faint impatience that crept into his tone when the moderator offered yet another question framed in policy rather than passion. And then, as if some unseen line had been crossed, Bernie made his move. His voice, already firm, hardened. His eyes, already sharp, seemed to glint with something more than conviction, a challenge. JD talks about working people, Bernie said, pausing just long enough for the words to hang heavy in the air. But he works for billionaires? It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it, with a certainty that brooked no argument, with the cadence of a man who had spent a lifetime drawing lines between right and wrong, the people and the powerful. The moment the words left his mouth, the audience reacted. A low ripple of laughter rolled through the room, the kind that begins as a nervous chuckle and gathers momentum, emboldened by the safety of numbers. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to sting, enough to remind JD that in this arena, words could cut deeper than any blade. JD stood motionless, his posture unbroken, his face a mask of calm. But inside he felt it, the heat rising, the sharp sting of the insult, the weight of millions watching not just what he would say next, but how he would bear the blow. He thought of the men and women he'd met in factory towns, the ones who had pulled him aside and said, "Don't let them talk down to us. Don't let them forget we exist." He had promised to be their voice, and now that promise felt heavier than ever. The moderator shifted in his seat, uncertainty flickering across his face. This wasn't where he had meant the debate to go. The questions had been crafted to draw out vision, not venom. But here they were, teetering at the edge of spectacle, the kind that garners headlines but risks losing the substance beneath. He hesitated, his fingers brushing the stack of prepared notes as if searching for the next question that might pull them back from the brink. And in that breath between moments, JD held himself still. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every nuance. The steady eyes, the measured breath, the slight tightening at the corner of his mouth that spoke of resolve. He could have fired back then, could have met insult with insult, turned the tide with a sharp retort. But he didn't. Not yet. Because JD understood that sometimes the most powerful answer was the one you waited to give. The laughter in the room ebbed, leaving behind a tension thicker than before. Across the stage, Bernie stood confident, sure that he had landed the first real strike of the night. The crowd's reaction had given him that satisfaction, brief though it might be. But beneath the lights, under the scrutiny of millions, the real battle was only beginning. And as the moderator cleared his throat to move on, as the nation leaned in, JD's silence spoke louder than any words he might have chosen in that instant. It was a silence filled with meaning, with promise, with the calm before the storm that everyone now sensed was coming. The moment of laughter had faded, but its echo lingered in the air, a reminder of the strike Bernie had just delivered. And sensing the advantage, Bernie didn't pause. He pressed forward, his voice rising, his words gaining speed and force like a storm gathering strength. He spoke of the machinist in Michigan who watched his job shipped overseas while CEOs collected bonuses. He spoke of the waitress in Vermont working 2 jobs yet still unable to afford rent. His hands punctuated each point, his tone carrying the urgency of a man who had lived these stories in the faces of those who told them. And with each example, each sharp indictment of greed and betrayal, Bernie's gaze returned, again and again, to JD. "These are the people forgotten by Washington," Bernie declared, his voice filling the hall. "And yet here you are, JD, the polished messenger for those same billionaires who profit off their pain." The words hit hard, not just because of their content, but because of the rhythm, the momentum, the conviction that made them hard to ignore. JD stepped forward slightly, drawing breath, ready to respond. But before he could find his footing, Bernie continued, weaving story into accusation, painting JD not as an opponent with differing views, but as an emblem of the very system so many despised. JD spoke, his tone measured, his words deliberate. He spoke of real families, the factory worker in Ohio who told him that what he wanted wasn't a handout, but a chance to earn. He spoke of his mother who had worked nights to keep food on the table, of the dignity that came from honest work, and the betrayal felt when leaders signed deals that sent jobs away. But even as he spoke, it felt as if his words floated just beneath the surface of the roar Bernie had created. The crowd's energy leaned toward the louder voice, the broader strokes, the passion that filled the space so completely there was little room left for quiet truths. And beyond that stage, on screens large and small, the digital world reacted with the speed and ferocity of a lightning strike. Memes flooded social feeds within seconds. JD's image manipulated into marionette strings held by shadowy billionaires. Captions like "the puppet of the rich" and "corporate JD" trended on Twitter. Bernie's supporters shared, commented, amplified. For those watching online, the battle seemed one-sided, at least for now. Backstage, JD's team watched, their faces tight, their bodies leaning forward as if sheer will could bridge the widening gap on that stage. Aides exchanged quick glances, silently questioning. Should he hit back harder? Should he shift tactics? But none spoke, unwilling to break the unspoken rule. Out there, in that moment, it was JD alone who had to find the path forward. And on stage, JD knew it. He felt the storm at his back, the weight of perception turning against him. But he also felt something else, the steady pulse of conviction that had brought him here. He could hear his grandfather's voice in memory. "They'll try to talk over you, boy. Let 'em. When it counts, make 'em listen." And so JD steadied himself, waiting for the next question, for the next opening, knowing that battles are rarely won in the noise. They're won in the moment when the noise finally clears. The roar of Bernie's rhetoric still echoed as JD stood beneath the unrelenting glare of the lights, his face composed, but inside his heart pounded like a drum. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, not just the weight of Bernie's words or the sting of the crowd's reaction, but the heavier burden of all those who watched, who waited, who had placed their hopes on his shoulders. He inhaled slowly, deliberately, the memory of his own promise steadying him. Stay calm, don't let them see you break. And so he held his ground, even as the storm around him swirled louder. Across the country, millions watched in rapt attention. In diners and union halls, in city apartments and small-town living rooms, the debate had become more than just a contest of ideas. It had become theater, raw, unscripted, electric. Some viewers leaned forward, their sympathy stirred by the sight of JD standing silent against the tide, seeing in him the image of a man outnumbered but unbowed. Others, swept up in Bernie's fire, cheered from their seats, energized by what they saw as a righteous takedown of the establishment's polished messenger. And then there were those who simply watched, hearts pounding, unable to look away, knowing that something important was unfolding before them, but unsure yet what it meant. JD's mind worked as fast as his pulse. The instinct to respond, to strike back, surged within him. But deeper still was the voice he trusted most. Wait for the moment. Let him overplay his hand. It was a lesson taught in the quiet moments, far from stages and cameras. In the hard-won wisdom of those who knew that sometimes the most powerful blow was the one that came last, not first. He could hear his grandfather's voice, quiet but firm. Don't rush. Let the noise pass. The right moment will find you. And so, JD steadied his breath, forced himself to listen, to watch, to prepare. The camera caught every flicker of emotion, every tightening of his jaw, every measured blink, every breath drawn and held just a second longer than usual. Bernie's words filled the space still, sharp and confident, painting JD as the polished shield of the billionaires, as the man sent to defend what couldn't be defended. The crowd's energy, the force of Bernie's momentum, pressed closer, as if daring JD to falter, to lash out, to prove Bernie's picture true. And backstage, JD's team felt the tension just as keenly. Eyes darted between monitors, hands clenched, unspoken questions hanging in the air. Should he counter now? Should he change course? But none dared break the moment. They too waited, knowing their candidate better than anyone. JD wouldn't be baited. He would choose his time. He always had. Bernie, sensing the moment his, allowed himself the smallest of triumphs, a smirk that flickered across his face, a silent victory claimed in the space between words. But JD saw it, and in that brief flash of confidence, he saw something else. The first crack, the first sign that Bernie believed the battle won too soon. JD drew a slow, steady breath, the kind that quiets the mind and sharpens the focus. His gaze didn't waver, his voice remained silent, but inside he felt the shift. The storm was not over. The storm was only gathering strength. And as the cameras kept rolling, as the nation held its collective breath, the question that hung unspoken was no longer whether JD would respond. It was how and when. The room felt as if it had shrunk, the air thick with anticipation. The moment had been building, word by word, look by look, until now when the weight of unspoken tension finally demanded release. Bernie Sanders, his voice edged with the certainty of a man who believed he had cornered his opponent, lifted his hand, his finger pointing squarely at JD Vance. His eyes locked on JD's, and with a voice that rang out across the studio and into millions of homes, he delivered the blow. "You're a polished pawn," Bernie declared, his tone rising with righteous indignation. "Selling out this country's future while you smile." The words struck like a hammer. In that instant, the energy in the room shifted. A roar of approval erupted from the audience. Not a polite ripple of applause, but a surge of noise that filled the space. A tide that seemed to wash over JD and press him further back beneath its force. The sound was more than support for Bernie's words. It was the release of tension that had gripped the room, the collective exhale of a crowd eager for a decisive moment. JD felt the wave hit him. For a fraction of a second, a blink, a breath, his posture seemed to falter, his shoulders drawing in just slightly, his gaze lowering as if to absorb the weight of the accusation. It wasn't just the insult itself, brutal as it was. It was the truth that, in this arena, perception was as powerful as reality. And in that moment, the perception was clear. Bernie had landed a blow that might prove fatal, at least in the eyes of those watching. The cameras didn't miss it. They caught the subtle change in JD's expression, the flicker of doubt that crossed his face before he mastered it again, the quick swallow as he gathered himself. And across newsrooms and social feeds, commentators pounced. In hushed voices meant to sound impartial but laced with the excitement of the moment, they whispered to each other, to viewers, to history itself. That may have sealed it for Bernie. The hush that had settled over the room felt almost sacred, as if the space itself understood the weight of the next moment. JD stood still, the fire inside him no longer hidden but now tempered, focused. The cameras leaned in, catching the subtle lift of his chin, the way his shoulders squared, not with defiance but with quiet certainty. And then, after what felt to the crowd like the longest silence of the night, his voice came, soft, but clear enough to slice through the tension that had thickened the air. "You want to talk about pawns?" JD said, his words measured, each syllable deliberate. "Let's talk." The shift was immediate. The murmur of the audience stilled, as if some invisible hand had reached out and calmed the restless energy that moments ago had crackled with cheers for Bernie's attack. There was something in JD's tone, not anger, not indignation, but resolve. A resolve that invited no interruption, that signaled to all who heard it that he was not finished, that he had chosen this moment for a reason. Bernie's eyes flashed, his grin spreading wide, confident that he had forced his opponent to respond on his terms. In that grin was the satisfaction of a man who believed he had set the field, controlled the tempo, dictated the terms of the exchange. He waited, arms folded loosely, prepared to parry whatever defense JD might attempt, certain that his own momentum was too great now to be turned aside. But JD was not preparing a defense. He was preparing something far more dangerous. The truth, sharpened and honed, ready to be revealed at precisely the right moment. His mind, so calm on the surface, worked quickly, sifting through the stories, the facts, the promises made and broken that he carried with him onto this stage. He felt them align now, like pieces of a puzzle sliding into place, forming a picture he knew Bernie did not expect, a picture Bernie had hoped would stay hidden behind the power of his words. The studio felt smaller suddenly, as if drawn in around the two men. The audience leaned forward, sensing instinctively that the rhythm of the night was about to change. No longer the roar of competing voices, no longer the clamor of applause or jeers, but the quiet before the moment that would define everything that followed. JD's eyes stayed locked on Bernie's, not in challenge, but in something deeper, the gaze of a man who saw not just an opponent, but the gap between the words spoken and the truths lived. In homes across the country, viewers did the same, leaning in, hearts quickening, caught between the memory of Bernie's blow and the anticipation of what JD might say next. On social media, the chatter slowed, as if the digital world itself paused to listen, to see if this was the turning point that would shift the night, the debate, perhaps even the course of the larger fight that raged far beyond that stage. And as JD drew in another breath, steady and sure, he felt it. The moment had come. Not forced, not seized in haste, but earned. His words would come next, not as a reaction, but as the revelation that silence and patience had built toward all along. And as he prepared to speak, the crowd sensed it too. Something was about to break, and once it did, nothing would be as it had been before. The air felt electric, every pair of eyes in the room locked onto JD as he stood, shoulders square, voice steady. The silence of anticipation had stretched taut, ready to snap. And then, without raising his voice, without theatrics or flourish, JD asked the question that would change everything. "Senator," he began, his tone measured but unyielding, "who funds this very broadcast? Who signed your campaign's biggest checks last year?" It was as if the studio exhaled all at once, only to fall into a breathless hush. The audience, moments before energized by Bernie's confident strikes, froze in place. The sound of the cameras, the faint rustle of paper, even the soft hum of stage lights seemed to vanish, swallowed by the weight of JD's words. Bernie, who only a heartbeat ago had stood tall, smirk strong, arms folded in quiet triumph, felt the grin slip from his face, replaced by the first flicker of uncertainty. JD didn't pause. His hand moved with the precision of a man who had prepared for this moment long before tonight, long before the first word of the debate was spoken. From the folder at his side, he drew a set of papers, plain, unassuming, but in this instant more powerful than any speech. He held them up, not for dramatic effect, but so that all could see what he carried: names, amounts, signatures. The truth in black and white. Out in living rooms, bars, union halls, the nation reacted. Some cheered, exhilarated by Bernie's defiance, his directness, his willingness to say what many had long felt. Others watched in stunned silence, hearts heavy, seeing in JD's momentary retreat the image of a man overwhelmed, a voice perhaps not strong enough to weather the storm. And others still leaned forward, not ready to claim victory or defeat for either man, but knowing that something significant had just taken place, something that might define not only this night, but what came after. But within JD, beneath the surface where no camera could see, a different storm raged. The sting of the words was real, but so too was the resolve that answered it. He reminded himself, even in that instant, of why he stood there, of who he stood for. His grandfather's quiet strength, his mother's sacrifices, the families who had told him their stories, their hopes, their fears. He felt their weight, yes, but also their steadying force. Bernie, for his part, allowed himself a small breath of triumph. His smirk returned, fleeting but unmistakable. A man who believed he had just carved his mark on the night. The applause echoed in his ears, the validation he had sought. But in that same breath, JD lifted his head, met Bernie's gaze, and drew in a slow, steady breath. And in that breath was a promise, not of immediate retaliation, but of a response that, when it came, would not be forgotten. The last echoes of applause faded, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the noise that had come before. The energy in the room shifted again, not with the roar of victory or the sharp crack of another attack, but with the stillness that settles when something is about to change. JD stood motionless beneath the lights, the weight of millions of eyes upon him. The camera zoomed in, drawing closer, as if the lens itself sought to capture whatever it was that held him silent in this moment. The crowd, moments ago so loud, leaned forward in their seats, as if afraid to break the spell. Even Bernie, flushed with the triumph of his last strike, watched, waiting to see whether his opponent would shatter or stand. Inside JD's mind, the noise of the room faded, replaced by the echoes of a different kind of sound, the voices and moments that had shaped him long before he set foot on this stage. He saw again his father, the day the mill closed, standing in the kitchen doorway, shoulders slumped not from exhaustion, but from defeat. He heard again the heavy silence of that house when there was no paycheck, no plan, no promise that tomorrow would be better. He felt again the helplessness of watching his mother at the kitchen table late at night, head bowed over bills she could not pay, tears slipping down her face as she tried to hide them from her children. These weren't abstract memories. They weren't distant. They lived in him still, as sharp and real as the moment they had first occurred. JD's heart raced, but his face remained still, his gaze steady. He could hear his own inner voice, quieter than the roar that had surrounded him, but stronger, more certain. This isn't about me. This is for them. The words repeated in his mind like a mantra, grounding him. It wasn't about his pride, or the sting of an insult broadcast to the world. It wasn't about winning a moment or losing one. It was about standing for those who couldn't stand there themselves, for the fathers who had lost everything, for the mothers who had borne the weight of uncertainty alone, for the children who had watched, learned, and remembered. And in that pause, longer than anyone expected, yet perfectly measured, the air in the studio seemed to shift. The audience, so quick to cheer Bernie's last blow, now watched JD with new eyes. They sensed it, even if they couldn't name it. Something was happening beneath the surface, something that might matter far more than the clash of loud words. The hush became its own kind of roar, the kind that demands attention not with sound, but with the absence of it. A breath held, a heart waiting to beat again. The cameras held tight on JD's face, searching for the crack that never came. Instead, they captured the stillness of a man who had chosen his ground and would not be moved. Bernie, sensing the change, shifted slightly, his earlier confidence tempered now by a flicker of uncertainty. The crowd waited. The nation waited. And in that waiting, the balance of the night began, ever so slightly, to shift. JD inhaled slowly, deeply, the kind of breath that fills not just the lungs but the soul. His silence wasn't a retreat. It was the calm before the storm, the gathering of strength before the answer that would change everything. "These are the records, Senator," JD continued, his voice unwavering. "Corporate donors, the very corporations you claim to fight, The same ones whose executives signed the checks that helped put you on this stage tonight. I respect passion, Senator. I respect conviction. But the people watching tonight deserve honesty. Not just in words, in deeds. For a moment that felt suspended in time, Bernie said nothing. His mouth opened slightly as if to answer, but no sound came. His eyes darted briefly toward the moderator, toward the audience, as though searching for an anchor in the storm that had suddenly turned against him. The confidence that had filled the room, that had carried him through every fiery word, ebbed away, leaving in its place a silence that spoke louder than any defense could have. In homes across America, viewers gasped. It wasn't just the accusation, it was the evidence, the precision, the undeniable simplicity of what JD had revealed. Some stared at their screens, stunned. Others shook their heads, the foundation of their trust shaken. And still others, who had watched the night unfold in uneasy silence, felt something stir. A recognition that the balance had shifted, that the story of the evening had changed in the space of a single question. The moderator hesitated, glancing between the two men, unsure whether to intervene, to move on, or to let the moment play out. The camera zoomed in on Bernie's face, catching the flicker of discomfort, the tightness at his jaw, the way his fingers curled against the edge of his podium, as if trying to grasp what had just slipped from his control. JD stood firm, papers still in hand, eyes steady, breath calm. He had waited, endured, absorbed the blows, and now in this moment he had done what he came to do, reveal the truth, not with volume, but with quiet certainty. The room, the nation, watched and waited for what would come next. The room remained gripped in that heavy silence, the kind that falls when the truth enters a space and leaves no room for noise. JD didn't hesitate. His voice, steady as a steel beam, filled the studio without needing to rise. He held the papers before him, and with the quiet authority of a man who had done his homework not for points, not for applause, but because the truth demanded it, he began to read. In the last election cycle, JD said, his eyes flicking between the pages and Bernie, your campaign accepted contributions from Horizon Global Holdings, a name you've called out on this very stage for exploiting workers overseas. That's $250,000, Senator, from the very people you claim to fight. Bernie shifted, his fingers tightening on the edge of his podium, his mouth parting as if to respond. But JD continued, his voice unwavering, his pace deliberate, the facts laid out like a ledger for all to see. There's more, JD went on. Seaboard Energy, another $175,000. A corporation you've condemned for environmental violations and offshoring jobs. And here, documentation of speaking fees paid by companies whose names your campaign literature paints as enemies of the people. Bernie's voice finally rose, cutting in, but his words, so full of fire earlier, now rang hollow. Those funds, those were bundled by grassroots, he tried, but the conviction that had carried his earlier attacks seemed to falter beneath the weight of what was now laid bare. His interruptions, once sharp and commanding, sounded strained, as if even he knew the ground beneath him was crumbling. JD didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He turned from Bernie, facing instead the cameras, the nation beyond the glass lenses. His eyes steady, his tone calm, he spoke as if to each person watching at home, as if inviting them into the conversation that had, until this moment, been dominated by noise. We've all been sold slogans, JD said, his voice carrying the quiet force of conviction. But we deserve facts. We deserve leaders who don't just say the right things, but live them, who don't point fingers while their own hands aren't clean. Tonight isn't about me. It isn't about Senator Sanders. It's about all of you, about whether we'll let words distract us from the truth. The studio, which only minutes ago had echoed with laughter and applause for Bernie's blows, now seemed to hold its breath. The shift was palpable. Even those who had cheered loudest for Bernie's attacks now watched in silence, caught between disbelief and the dawning realization of what had just unfolded. The hum of cameras returned, subtle but insistent, as if the machines themselves knew they were recording a turning point. And outside the studio, the digital world ignited. Social media feeds flooded with reactions. Clips of JD's words spreading at lightning speed. Hashtags climbing the charts within seconds. Hashtag truth wins. Hashtag JD 2 minutes. Comment threads filled with arguments, praise, shock, outrage. Memes were born in real time. Not mocking JD this time, but capturing Bernie's stunned expression, JD's calm delivery, the moment when the story of the night shifted. Bernie stood silent now, his earlier momentum dissipated, replaced by a stillness that carried no triumph. JD lowered the papers slowly. No flourish, no victory pose, just the quiet confidence of a man who had said what needed saying. And as the moderator, hesitant, unsure, glanced between them, the room seemed to pulse with a single unspoken truth. The storm had broken, and nothing would be the same again. Bernie stood still, his earlier fire dimmed, his words caught somewhere between thought and breath. The man who had moments ago commanded the room with his booming voice and cutting lines now found himself adrift in a silence he no longer controlled. His eyes searched the crowd, the moderator, the cameras, perhaps looking for a way to reclaim the ground that had so suddenly slipped from beneath him. But there was no rescue in sight. The tide had turned, and all knew it, even Bernie himself. JD remained composed. There was no gloating in his gaze, no triumph painted across his face. His tone, when he spoke again, was as it had been all along, respectful, steady, but now carrying a weight that came not from volume, but from truth. He had no need to press the advantage with taunts or theatrics. The facts had spoken, and their echo still filled the space between them. "I don't want applause," JD said, his voice clear, resonating not just through the room, but through the screens of millions watching at home. "I want a future where we can trust again." The simplicity of it landed with more force than any fiery speech could have. The crowd, caught off guard by the shift in the night's energy, hesitated, just for a heartbeat, before the applause began. But this applause was different from the cheers that had followed Bernie's earlier blows. It started slowly, a ripple of hands coming together in recognition, then grew, swelling to fill the studio. It was applause not for spectacle, but for substance. Not for a man who had won a point, but for one who had reclaimed dignity for himself and for those he spoke for. Bernie's smirk was gone. His shoulders, once squared in defiance, now lowered ever so slightly, the posture of a man who realized that this night would not be remembered for his strongest line, but for the moment he had underestimated his opponent and paid the price. The moderator, sensing the shift, glanced down at his notes but found no question that could match the gravity of what had just transpired. JD let the applause wash over him, not as victory, but as validation that the storm he had weathered had not been endured in vain. His eyes moved across the audience, not searching for approval, but acknowledging the change he felt in the air, the subtle but unmistakable recognition that the narrative of the night had rewritten itself before their eyes. And beyond the studio walls across the nation, millions felt it too. That sense that they had just witnessed not a debate as usual, but a moment that would be talked about long after the cameras stopped rolling. On social media, the transformation was immediate. The memes that had painted JD as a puppet, a pawn, a tool of the wealthy, now found themselves crowded out by clips of his quiet strength, his measured words, his refusal to be baited, his power drawn not from showmanship but from substance. Hashtags shifted, hashtag trust again, hashtag JD truth, hashtag debate turnaround. Even some of Bernie's most ardent defenders fell silent or began to type slower, their certainty shaken. And as the applause slowly ebbed, replaced by a quiet that felt almost reverent, JD drew in one last steadying breath. He knew the night wasn't over, that questions would continue, that challenges would come. But he also knew this: the moment that would define the night, and perhaps his place in the hearts of those watching, had arrived. And he had met it not with noise, but with truth. The reversal was complete. The storm, for now, had passed. The applause that had filled the studio finally ebbed, replaced by the soft rustle of papers, the subtle clearing of throats, and the hum of cameras still capturing every angle of a night that no one could have predicted. But outside those walls, beyond the lights and the stage, the world was already reacting. Screens across America lit up with headlines that spread faster than even the applause had echoed. J.D. Vance exposes Sanders' hypocrisy, the 2-minute moment that changed the debate. From pawn to master, how J.D. flipped the script. It was as if the entire nation had been waiting for a single spark, and now that it had come, the fire spread in every direction. Clips of Bernie's stunned face raced across social media feeds, edited into slow motion, looped, captioned with phrases like, "the moment it all fell apart," and "when the truth hit." The same platforms that minutes ago had been filled with memes mocking JD, now flooded with footage of his calm, steady delivery, his quiet dismantling of Bernie's narrative. The hashtags that trended were no longer about Bernie's dominance, but JD's turnaround. Hashtag JD 2 minutes, hashtag debate shift, hashtag truth over noise. In comment sections and group chats, people debated not just who had won the night, but what it meant for the future. The tide had turned, and everyone could feel it. Backstage, JD's team sat in a circle of quiet triumph. There were no high fives, no loud celebrations, only the kind of deep exhale that comes after a storm has passed. A senior advisor leaned forward, voice low, as if afraid to break the fragile spell of the moment. "You did it," he said simply. "You stayed steady, and they saw it." Others nodded, their relief visible in their softened postures, the tension of the evening slowly leaving their shoulders. They exchanged looks, half smiles, the looks of people who had watched their candidate walk a tightrope and reach the other side. But at the center of it all, JD stood apart from the quiet pride of his team. His hands rested on the edge of the table before him, his gaze fixed not on the headlines flashing on the monitors or the congratulatory nods of his staff, but on a point in the distance. A point only he could see. Inside, he felt the weight of what had just happened. Yes, he had reclaimed the narrative, had exposed the contradictions that Bernie had hoped would stay hidden, had reminded the nation that quiet truth could triumph over loud rhetoric. But along with that victory came something else, a question that gnawed at the edge of his thoughts. Did it have to end this way? He had come to the stage not to destroy a man, but to defend an idea. The dignity of work, the worth of honest truth over hollow slogans. And yet, as he stood now, watching the ripple effects of his words spread across the country, he wondered what the cost would be, not to him, not even to Bernie, but to the larger hope that debate could still be about lifting up, not tearing down. The weight of that thought settled on him, even as the world celebrated his moment. In the studio, the moderator moved to the next question, but the room still hummed with the aftershock of what had passed. Bernie, quieter now, adjusted his notes, his eyes lowered in thought, and JD, steadying himself, drew in a slow breath. The night was not over. The questions would keep coming, but nothing would be the same again. The applause, the cameras, the chatter of commentators faded behind the curtain, but none of it faded from Bernie's mind. He walked slowly, almost mechanically, down the narrow hallway that led to the backstage lounge, his footsteps echoing softly on the polished floor. When he reached the small room set aside for him, he stopped, as if unsure what to do next. The room was quiet, the hum of the debate now distant, like the memory of a storm that had already passed. Bernie sank into a chair, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the floor beneath his feet. The weight of the moment pressed down, heavier than the lights that had shone on him, heavier than the expectations he had carried into the night. The words replayed, unbidden, unstoppable. JD's voice, calm but cutting, the question that had landed with more force than any shouted accusation. Who funds this very broadcast? Who signed your campaign's biggest checks last year? And then, the papers, the names, the amounts, all laid bare before the nation. Bernie tried to summon the fire that had carried him through decades of battles, tried to feel the righteous anger that had so often been his shield. But what rose instead was a hollow ache, the kind that comes when a man sees, too clearly, the line between what he had meant to be and what tonight he had been. He closed his eyes, but the images wouldn't leave him. JD's steady gaze, the shift in the crowd's energy, the applause that had once been his, now offered to the man he had tried so hard to paint as the villain, and beneath it all, the echo of his own mistakes. Small choices, justified at the time, that had gathered like stones in his pockets until they dragged him down. He had told himself it was the price of doing battle in a system built to protect the powerful. He had told himself he could take their money, their platforms, and still speak the truth. But tonight, under the lights, JD had shown how fragile that justification had always been. The door creaked open, and one of his oldest aides stepped inside, face lined not with judgment, but with concern. "Senator," she said softly, as if afraid to disturb the stillness, "it wasn't as bad as it feels right now. We've been through worse nights. People will remember all the good you've done. This doesn't erase that." Bernie didn't look up. He heard her words, and in some part of him, he even believed them. But the truth that weighed on him now wasn't about polls or headlines or even legacy. It was about the moment when he had let himself believe that passion alone would be enough, that he could stand on that stage and not be called to account for the compromises he had made. And in that belief, he had been wrong. Another aide appeared, offering a glass of water, a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Bernie nodded, but his eyes remained on the floor, as if searching for something lost. Not just the edge he'd held at the start of the night, but perhaps the certainty that had carried him through so many fights before this one. The damage he knew was done, not just in the eyes of those who watched, but in his own. The reckoning had come, and no spin, no speech, no strategy could change what had already passed. Outside, the debate moved on, but for Bernie, the night had shifted forever. And as he sat in that quiet room, the noise of the world distant and muffled, he drew in a long, slow breath and faced the hardest truth of all, that sometimes even the fiercest fighters must face the limits of their own choices. Outside the quiet room where Bernie sat with his thoughts, the country was anything but still. In town halls where folding chairs had been lined up for debate watch parties, in bars where televisions still glowed in the dim light, in break rooms of factories where workers had crowded around old screens, the conversation raged. What had begun as a political event had become something else entirely. A national reckoning, a flashpoint that stirred emotions raw and real. In an Ohio diner, two older men leaned over their coffee, voices low but urgent. "I hate to see Bernie fall like that," one said, shaking his head. "I believed him. Still do. But tonight, I don't know. It felt like something broke." Across the booth, his friend nodded, fingers drumming nervously on the Formica table. "It's not the word, he said. It's what we saw. The look on his face when JD hit him with the truth. Can't unsee that." In a union hall in Pennsylvania, the debate took a sharper edge. A younger worker, fists clenched at his sides, argued, "JD just showed what we've been saying for years. They all talk, but they don't live it. I don't care what party they're in." JD stood up there and didn't flinch. An older colleague pushed back, voice rough with emotion. "Bernie's been fighting for us his whole life. One bad night doesn't erase that. Don't throw him away because of one damn moment." The room filled with voices, overlapping, passionate, divided. A microcosm of a nation wrestling with what it had seen. And in factories where the night shift had paused to catch the final moments, workers debated as they clocked out, their faces drawn but animated. Some mourned Bernie's fall, the collapse of a symbol they had trusted. Others celebrated JD's composure, his courage in the face of mockery, his quiet turning of the tide. And in homes, in group chats, in online threads that seemed endless, the arguments continued, fierce and unrelenting, as if the country itself couldn't let go of what it had witnessed. Meanwhile, JD chose not to linger in green rooms or bask in the glow of headlines that now praised him. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, he stepped onto the grounds of a steel mill in the heart of Ohio. The air smelled of oil and earth, of work that mattered. The mill had reopened only months before, a symbol of the kind of renewal JD spoke of on the campaign trail. Now its workers, men and women with grease-streaked hands and tired eyes, gathered to meet him as word spread that he had come. There were no speeches, no cameras, just handshakes, nods, and words quietly spoken. A middle-aged welder, his voice thick with emotion, said, "You didn't let him talk over us. You said what needed saying. That means more than you know." A young woman, hard hat tucked under her arm, added, "You stood your ground. That's what we need. Somebody who doesn't just talk, but stands." JD listened, humbled, the weight of the night before still with him, but steadied now by the simple, unpolished gratitude of those whose voices too often went unheard. And as he left the mill, the hum of machinery behind him, JD understood. The debate might have been fought on a stage, but its meaning lived here, in places like this, in people like them. The storm had passed, but its impact had only begun to take root. The first light of dawn spilled through the tall windows of JD's office, casting long, pale stripes across the floor and onto the worn desk where his hands now rested. Still. Outside, the world stirred. Cars rolled along distant streets, birds called softly from hidden perches, and the hum of a nation returning to its daily rhythm began to rise. But inside, JD sat in stillness, untouched by the noise beyond the glass. The storm of the night before had passed, but its weight remained, settled on his shoulders like a mantle he could not yet lay down. His eyes, red-rimmed from a night with little sleep, traced the edge of a photograph that lay before him. A black and white image, its corners frayed, of his grandfather at the mill. The man's hands were the first thing JD had always noticed in that picture. Broad, rough, marked by work that built the bones of cities. Those hands had held tools with skill, lifted JD high into the air when he was a boy, and rested heavy but gentle on his shoulder the day he left for college. They were hands that spoke of a life of dignity, a life that asked for no applause, only the chance to do what was right. JD's own fingers brushed the photo's surface now, as if the connection could pass through time and paper. The memory of those hands, of what they stood for, felt nearer this morning than it had in years. He had thought of them on the stage the night before, in the quiet moments when the cameras had captured his stillness, when the words of his opponent had sought to break him, when the tide of the crowd had threatened to wash over him, and he thought of them now as he weighed the cost of what had transpired. The victory, if that was the word for it, felt heavy. The truth had prevailed, yes. Facts over slogans, deeds over words. He had held his ground, not with anger or showmanship, but with the simple, stubborn resolve that his grandfather had taught him. And yet, beneath the sense of duty fulfilled, there was no elation, no rush of triumph, only the quiet ache that came with knowing that in defending what mattered, something had been lost too. The chance for that night to have been a meeting of ideas, rather than a clash that left one man standing and the other diminished. JD leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him, and let his gaze drift to the skyline beyond his window. The sun had risen fully now, painting the tops of buildings in golden fire, banishing the last of the shadows that night had left behind. Somewhere out there, people were waking to headlines, to commentary, to the endless churn of opinion that would dissect and debate the night's events. But here, in this quiet hour, JD let himself feel the truth that no headline would capture. That standing for what is right is not measured in applause or in polls, or in the cleverness of a line delivered at just the right moment. It is measured in whether you kept the promise made long ago, to be a voice for those who have none, to carry forward the hopes of a boy who once watched his grandfather come home, weary but proud. And as the light grew stronger, JD folded the photograph gently, placed it back in its worn leather case, and rose. The day lay ahead, full of challenges and noise and the endless work of trying to serve well. But in this quiet morning, he had found his footing again. The price had been real, the truth had prevailed, and the work, the real work, was only beginning. The morning after brought not just reflection, but a flood of attention. JD's phone buzzed with interview requests from national news anchors, podcast hosts, late-night talk shows, even global outlets eager to hear from the man who had quietly shifted the course of a debate. But JD, seated in his office with the weight of dawn still fresh in his mind, turned most of them away. It wasn't false humility, nor fear of the spotlight. It was a choice to let actions, not applause, define what came next. Instead, JD traveled to a small veterans hall in a town that rarely made the news. The room was modest, the crowd humble but attentive. No cameras, no stage lights, just neighbors, veterans, and working families who had gathered not for spectacle, but for substance. J.D. stood at the podium, the steelworker's pin on his lapel glinting in the soft morning light, and spoke with the same calm resolve that had steadied him days earlier. "We didn't win by beating a man," he said quietly. "We won by standing for something." His words landed not with fanfare, but with the kind of respect that fills a room when truth is spoken plainly. And as he left the hall, shaking hands and listening more than speaking, J.D. felt the gravity of what came with that moment. His popularity surged, praise from unexpected corners, admiration from those who once doubted him. But with it came scrutiny. Every choice he had made, every vote he had cast, every donor's name now surfaced under a sharper light. And as he stepped into the crisp air outside, J.D. understood. This was the real cost of the fight. The moment had passed, but the test was only beginning. The day had been long, filled with voices, some praising, some questioning, some shouting to be heard above the noise of headlines and commentary. But as the sun dipped low, casting the world in the soft gold of approaching dusk, J.D. found himself alone in his office once more. The hum of the city outside was distant, the clatter of political life momentarily muted. His thoughts drifted, not to strategy or speeches, but to the weight of what lay ahead. And then the phone rang. He glanced at the screen, surprise flickering across his face at the name displayed there. He hesitated for a breath, then answered. "Senator Sanders," J.D. said quietly, uncertain what to expect. The voice on the other end, so often fiery, now came softened by the moment. "You fought well last night," Bernie said. There was no bitterness in his tone, no edge, only the weariness of a man who had given all he had. "Make it count. Don't waste it." The words, simple but sincere, settled over J.D. like a mantle heavier than applause or victory. He drew in a breath, steadying himself before answering. "I'll try," he said, and he meant it. Because in that moment, stripped of stage lights and cameras, of crowd noise and commentary, what remained between them was not rivalry, but respect. The kind born only from battle honestly fought. There was no need for more. No grand declarations, no promises beyond the quiet understanding that passed between them. Bernie's line clicked off, leaving J.D. in the hush of the fading day, the weight of those final words lingering. Outside, the city moved on. Inside, J.D. sat for a long while. The meaning of the call, of the night, of the fight, settling deep into his bones. The storm of debate night had passed, but its echoes remained. Across the nation, as the headlines faded and the viral clips slowed their relentless spread, people began to look inward. The frenzy of opinions that had flooded the airwaves, the memes that had lit up social media, the arguments that had filled diners and living rooms, all gave way to quieter conversations. The night's spectacle was over. What lingered was the deeper question of what it meant. In a small high school classroom in Indiana, a civics teacher dimmed the lights and queued up the recording of the debate. The students, many of whom had only half paid attention the night before, now leaned forward, watching not for entertainment, but for meaning. They saw the moment when J.D. had stood still, absorbed the storm, and waited. They heard the question that turned the tide, the calm voice that didn't seek to wound, but to reveal. And when the video ended, the teacher asked simply, "What is courage?" The room filled with voices, hesitant at first, then more certain. One student spoke of the strength it took to stay silent when mocked. Another spoke of truth spoken without malice. A third said quietly, "It wasn't about beating him, it was about standing for something." The teacher nodded, seeing in their answers the beginning of what the nation itself was starting to understand, that the night had not just been about politics. It had been about character. The 2-minute moment, as it quickly came to be known, entered the history books even before the ink dried on the next day's papers. Analysts wrote essays, educators wove it into lessons, not as a perfect example, but as a reminder of what could be, of how the power of words chosen well could shift the course of events. And in homes across America, parents spoke to their children about what they had seen, not as a political point, but as a lesson in grace under fire. Days later, after the noise of coverage had begun to quiet, JD sat alone in a modest recording studio. No large team, no polished script, just a microphone, a glass of water, and the weight of knowing that people would listen. The producer gave him the signal, and JD leaned in, speaking not to an audience of millions, but as if to a single person sitting across from him. "I've been asked a lot these past few days about what that night meant," JD began, his voice steady, his words chosen with care. "But I think we're asking the wrong question. It wasn't about destroying an opponent. That was never the point. It was about reminding ourselves, all of us, that trust matters, that dignity matters, that how we speak, how we stand, how we choose our words says as much about what kind of country we want as any policy ever could." He paused, letting the silence between thoughts speak for itself. "This isn't about left or right. It's about whether we're willing to see each other, really see each other, even when we disagree. Whether we're willing to build something better together instead of tearing each other down. That's the standard we should hold ourselves to. Not noise, not spectacle, but trust, truth, courage." Across the country, people listened, in cars during morning commutes, at kitchen tables over coffee, on walks through quiet neighborhoods. Some nodded in agreement, others pondered in silence, but all felt the sincerity in his tone, the absence of victory laps or point scoring. It wasn't a speech for headlines, it was a conversation, the kind the country had long needed. And when the podcast ended, listeners sat quietly for a moment, reflecting. Not on JD or Bernie or the debate stage, but on themselves and what they might choose when their moment came. Before the sun rose fully, JD walked alone along the paths that wound past the Capitol. The city was quiet at this hour, the monuments still in shadow, the air cool and clean before the day's noise began. His footsteps echoed softly on the stone, each one steady, deliberate. He passed workers hosing down sidewalks, nodded to an early riser walking a dog, but mostly he kept his eyes on the flag at the far end of his path. Still at rest, waiting for the first light of day to lift it once more. When he reached the steps that faced the great dome, he paused, letting the stillness of the moment settle around him. The flag began to rise, its fabric catching the first golden rays that broke over the horizon. The light touched the steelworker's pin on his lapel, making it gleam, a small, simple reflection of the morning sun. JD watched, his hands clasped behind his back, his mind quiet. In that silence, words came to him, not rehearsed, not planned, but true. "We don't save a nation with noise," he thought. "We save it with courage." He stood there for a long time, watching as the light grew stronger, as the city stirred, as a new day began. And when at last he turned to go, his steps were sure, his purpose clear. The work ahead would be hard. There would be new fights, new tests. But the standard had been set, not by the moment on stage, but by what followed, by the choice to speak with dignity, to listen with respect, to build where others might tear down. And as the city woke around him, JD Vance walked into the dawn, not as a man who had won a debate, but as one who had remembered and reminded others what it meant to stand for something true. This story reminds us that true strength isn't found in loud words, but in quiet courage and integrity. JD's journey shows how standing for truth can change not just a debate, but hearts and minds. It inspires us to believe that dignity in politics is still possible. What do you think matters most in moments of public challenge? The words we choose or the values we live by? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.